Hello, I'm Daniela Ritorto with BBC World News. Our top story, the crisis deepens in Crimea. As Russia's president meets his troops, Ukraine says Russia has given it 10 hours to surrender or face military assault. Western leaders try to halt Russia's advance into Ukraine. Britain says it's Europe's biggest crisis in the 21st century.
If Russia cannot be persuaded to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, there will have to be other consequences and other costs.
The dramatic first day of the trial of Oscar Pistorius. A witness says she heard blood-curdling screams. He denies murdering his girlfriend.
Do you understand the charges, Mr. Pistorius?
I do, my lady.
How do you plead?
Not guilty, my lady.
And this is how the director of 12 Years a Slave celebrated when the movie won the Best Actor at the Oscars. Thanks for joining us. There are conflicting reports as to whether Russia has issued an ultimatum to Ukrainian forces in the Crimea region to surrender or face a full-scale military assault. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defence says it's received a deadline of 5 a.m. local time. That's 300 hours GMT, but about 10 hours from now. But in the last few minutes, a Russian newspaper has quoted a Defence Ministry official saying those reports were absolute nonsense. Let's get all of the very latest from Kiev and my colleague Hugh Edwards, who's there.
A very good evening from Kiev. We are overlooking a very foggy Independence Square where the people of Ukraine are nervously monitoring the events in Crimea. In the past hours, Ukrainian forces have confirmed that they've been given an ultimatum by the Russians in Crimea to surrender or face the consequences. In the past few minutes, the Russians denied that. Despite a growing tide of diplomatic pressure from around the world, the Russians have said that their troops will remain in Ukraine until the political situation has been normalized. That is the word they're using. During the day here in Kiev, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague met the new Ukrainian Prime Minister and warned Russia of consequences if their forces were not withdrawn. We'll have the latest, we'll have the reaction from our correspondents across Ukraine, in the east and in Crimea, and from Moscow too. But first, this report by our correspondent Christian Fraser in Crimea, where the tensions are highest.
The pride of the Ukrainian Navy on a banner ripped from the wall of the staff headquarters today by a pro-Russian crowd that is fast losing patience. The base is surrounded by Russian soldiers, and yesterday this man, Admiral Denis Berezovsky, head of the Ukrainian Navy, switched sides, swearing his allegiance to Crimea and Moscow. Today he returned, urging others to follow him. But he underestimates the resolve of his successor standing next to him and the men and women he'd once commanded. Together in defiance they sung the Ukrainian anthem. Ukraine has not yet died, go the words, nor has her glory. But outside the crowd grew ever more restless. They shouted insults, but the young Ukrainian soldiers inside told me they were staying put.
Ukraine. Ukraine. You want Ukraine together?
Yes, of course.
And you'll stay?
Yes.
You're not coming out?
No.
You have to pity the Ukrainian rank and file. Isolated, under siege, their loyalties tested to the limit. Do they go with those officers who sworn allegiance to the new pro-Russian authority here in Crimea, or do they resist, as many seem willing to do, in the face of insurmountable odds?
Amid the confrontation, a brotherly tap on the hand from a Russian soldier. But there's no sign Moscow is relenting. In Perevalny, the Ukrainian Coastal Defense Division is still penned in. And across the peninsula, the troop build-up continues apace. Border guards in Kerch say they can see military vehicles massing on the Russian side of the border. Crimea is lost. Kiev knows it. But how far do President Putin's ambitions stretch? With Crimea won, might he turn to eastern Ukraine? And is there anything to stop him?
Well, that was our correspondent Christian Fraser. Very important for us this evening to get a little more clarity on the reports we've received in the past hour about an apparent ultimatum delivered by the Russians to Ukrainian forces in the region of Crimea, because this was the original report we got, that the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Navy in Crimea confirming a report on the Russian news agency Interfax, which claimed that the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet had issued an ultimatum to the Ukrainian service personnel to surrender their bases by 5 o'clock local time tomorrow morning. And those reports grew in strength. However, I have to say to you, in the past 5 minutes or so, we have received a different report. This is from the Russians. The Russian Defense Ministry denying any reports that an ultimatum has been given to troops in Crimea. And the quote from the spokesman there in Moscow is that this is utter nonsense. Spokesman for the Defense Ministry telling one of the Russian broadsheets. So confusing and conflicting reports there, and we'll try to get a little more clarity as the evening goes on. In the meantime, the United Nations Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has called on Russia and Ukraine not to do anything to escalate the tension. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis have intensified today, with European Union foreign ministers meeting in Brussels to discuss what sanctions could be taken against Moscow. Now, our correspondent, Sarah Rainsford, is in Kiev, and she has this report.
The world has been anxiously wondering what this man's next move would be. Tellingly, it's been to drop in on these military maneuvers in western Russia. It was the announcement of these exercises last week that first set international alarm bells ringing as to the Russian leader's intentions over Ukraine. So for now, it seems, the test of wills in this crisis goes on, even as the appeals from the West get more urgent. In the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, a gesture of solidarity and sympathy from William Hague for the dozens of protesters who died here overthrowing the previous pro-Russian leadership. Then on to talks with the new interim authorities. They're desperate for more international pressure on Russia to pull back its forces in Crimea. So far, the response has been words and warnings.
If this situation cannot be resolved, if Russia cannot be persuaded to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, there will have to be other consequences and other costs.
The Russians have continued to tighten their grip in Crimea, with word now from the Ukrainians of a Russian ultimatum to their forces there to surrender. There's no real expectation of a Western military response to all this. Instead, the talk is of negotiations and the deployment of international monitors. Ukraine is ethnically diverse. In the West, the majority are Ukrainian speakers. Many look to Europe for their future. In parts of the East, Russian speakers dominate. And in Crimea, almost 60% are ethnic Russians. To the major Western powers, this is Russia infringing Ukraine's sovereignty. That's not how Moscow sees it.
I repeat, this is a matter of defending our citizens and our compatriots, on defending the most important human right, the right to life.
Ukraine is torn between West and East, and in Kiev, in the aftermath of revolution, the new anxiety is how far the main international players are now prepared to push this new crisis. Nick Childs, BBC News.
Well, that was our correspondent Nick Childs there with the latest from where he's seeing it. And we're going to join Christian Fraser, our correspondent now in Sebastopol, because he's right in the heart of the Crimea, to tell us what his assessment is there of the tensions today. Christian, how do you see things?
Well, I'm going to address this ultimatum in quite a bit of caution, Hugh, because we have had a number of ultimatums since Friday, and many of them have come and gone. But I think you do detect, in the words of the Ukrainian Navy spokesman, and remember the Ukrainian Navy are heavily exposed here, a certain amount of nervousness. And that's understandable because Russia and Moscow are losing patience here. We've seen the tensions at the gates today, as you saw in my report. And it could become a dangerous confrontation because although they're under siege, these soldiers, they are heavily armed. They've refused to give up their weapons. And this could turn into a bloody shooting match if someone takes a wrong turn. And to give you a reflection of just how things have been stepped up today, since we are talking about the Navy, let me show you some pictures of the backdrop behind me in the daylight. This is a ship that we filmed in
the dusk tonight, which has been manoeuvred into the mouth of the harbour. It's, I don't know what kind of ship it is, Hugh, but it looks like a big cargo vessel that belongs to the Navy. It's got some heavy lifting gear on the back of it. And then further out at sea, you'll see from these pictures our cameraman Steve has shot that there are warships, and I think they're minesweepers, that are effectively crossing each other. They are patrolling outside the bay in Sevastopol, and that is new. That's been happening only in the past 5 or 6 hours. So the Russian presence is being built up, and we're seeing it not just here in Sevastopol, but also, we understand from border guards on the eastern coast, across the straits on the Russian border. They're explaining that they are seeing there a heavy build-up of Russian military vehicles.
Christian, for now, thank you very much. If there's more, of course, we'll be back to you straight away. Christian Fraser there in Sevastopol. Let's get the perspective in Moscow then. Richard Galpin, our correspondent, is there. Richard, we'll come in a second, if we may, to some of the economic and financial aspects of this crisis. First of all, your reading of these conflicting reports today about some kind of ultimatum being given.
Well, I think all we can say, to be honest, Hugh, is that there has been this absolute, clear, definitive denial from the Ministry of Defence. As you were saying a little bit earlier, the spokesman for the Ministry of Defence here saying it was utter nonsense. So, you know, we have to wait and see if anything happens over the next few hours or not. What we do know today, though, is that the military exercises which the Russian army have been carrying out, and the Air Force, in fact, in recent days in the western sector, which of course includes the border with Ukraine, do come to an end today, or have come to an end. And Mr. Putin was there to see part of the final day, and he was there with his defense minister and some of the most senior staff of the Russian military.
In all the debate in recent days, Richard, lots of talk about possible action against the Russians if they don't respond. William Hague and John Kerry talking about possible economic measures, if you like. Talk us through some of the financial context and what's been happening on the financial markets today, which might be giving President Putin some food for thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've seen two things. A big slide again in the ruble against the dollar. It's now at a record low. And also we have seen the main share markets here fall very significantly by about 10% at one point. So it's hitting the Russian economy pretty hard. And of course, I'm sure that Mr. Putin will be looking at that and having to calculate whether it's all worth it. Because, you know, if it did end up being a full-scale invasion, for example, a shooting war, then you would expect the markets to tumble yet further. And of course, that does have very serious consequences back here and, of course, beyond.
Richard, for now, thank you very much again. Richard Galpin there for us in Moscow. Of course, a very sharp focus on the events in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. In Brussels, the European Union keeping a very close eye on things. Chris Morris, our correspondent, is there. Chris, what is the perspective there, and what kind of intervention could they actually envisage, do you think, in diplomatic terms?
Well, all this talk of an ultimatum is interesting because one of the things that's a real focus here today is the fact that Russia and Ukraine aren't really talking to each other. They're talking at each other across the divide. And there's a strong feeling here that the longer that happens, the greater the chance for some kind of miscalculation which leads to real and possibly devastating military conflict. So there's a lot of talk backed by Britain, Germany and others about sending some kind of mediation mission. The German foreign minister said, look, you know, crisis diplomacy is not a weakness. We need to do this. We need to try and talk it through. But at the same time, part of the discussion is what kind of measures should we take against Russia if they simply refuse to give any ground. There's all sorts of economic sanctions which could be brought into play, of course, although that's tough for some European countries who have huge trading relationships with Russia. And in the last few minutes, I've actually just spoken to the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU. One thing he raised, he said they would be pushing for if Russia doesn't back down in Crimea, and that's to try to exclude Russia from this summer's World Cup in Brazil. He says there's precedent for that when Yugoslavia was thrown out of the European Championships in 1992 for its acts of territorial aggression. So lots to come, I think, a huge discussion to come on potential sanctions. Right now there's talk here in Brussels that there could well be a heads of government meeting, a full European summit, possibly as early as Thursday.
Chris, thanks very much again. Chris Morris for us there in Brussels. Well, we do know that the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, is apparently on his way to Kiev, hoping to arrive here tomorrow to take a view for himself of what's going on the ground. So let's get a view from Washington with our North America editor, Mark Mardell, who can tell us a little more about the Obama administration's perspective on this. Mark?
I think there's a sense that President Obama wants to orchestrate a very tough international response to this. He's under some criticism at home for the way he's behaved so far, and he's trying to get together an international community that will, first of all, isolate Russia and then punish it economically. The officials are talking about hurting Russia economically by cutting off planned trade relations, stopping the preparations for the G8 meeting in Russia in June, and really sort of putting Russia in a box. Now, the trouble is, this sort of diplomatic action takes time, whereas violence, military action on the ground is quick. And I think Chris is absolutely right that the aim has to be to get Ukraine and Russia talking directly. The Vice President, Joe Biden, has been speaking to Prime Minister Medvedev, and he said that is one of the things that must happen. The troops must withdraw to their previous positions, but also there must be direct talks between Russia and Ukraine to sort this out.
Mark, there is a view here in Kiev, in some quarters at least, that President Putin probably has factored in a pretty tough response from President Obama and other Western states. To what extent do you think Washington realise that, or know that, or fear that, and for that reason they're not expecting him to respond in a way that they'd like?
I think certainly that what they're talking about at the moment, the idea of monitors going in, this being an off-ramp to assure the safety of people of ethnic Russian heritage, I don't think they expect that to succeed. They do seem to feel that they are in the long term on the winning side. They say this is a sign of weakness from Putin. He has no soft power, they say. He has no power of attraction. Nobody wants to join with Russia, so he has to go in with the guns and the soldiers. That's all very well. It's an interesting point. Another phrase they keep using is he's behaving in a 19th century manner in the 21st century of interdependent relationships and complex economic ties. But the trouble is that those 19th century techniques sometimes work. It didn't, all the talk of sanctions and didn't scare him off from going into Georgia, and he sort of got what he wanted out of that. So I think that there is an annoyance in Washington that, and a worry about how this turns out. Because one of the things that they fear here is that some European countries so much want trade with Russia, they won't go along, they won't go the full hog. But I think there's a determination here to do something, partly, only partly, but because President Obama has been accused at home of being too weak in the past, and people reference back to the red lines in Syria that were crossed, and they ask the question, well, if that hadn't happened, would Putin have taken this more seriously? But I think it comes down to the fact that neither America nor anyone else is talking about military action, so they are left with this economic squeeze.
That was Mark Mardell in Washington speaking to Hugh Edwards in Kiev. And for more analysis and background to the crisis in Ukraine, have a look at a special section of the BBC News website. It also has, of course, all of the latest news updates. It's bbc.com/Ukraine. Well, do stay with us. We have plenty more to come later, including the dramatic first day of the trial of Oscar Pistorius. A witness said she heard blood-curdling screams on the night he shot his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp.
Phone stop.
I am not a morning person.
I hate early mornings.
Odbierz. Jadę, już jestem w drodze.
It's so cold.
Oh, it's freezing.
I'll never get used to this.
The wind. Headwind is the worst.
Boczny wiatr nie lubię go.
Wrong park.
Wrong wax. Złe szkła.
I will never land this.
Too tired.
My whole body hurts.
Every muscle hurts.
I can't sleep.
But you know what my real problem is? I hate losing.
This is BBC World News. I'm Daniela Retorto. These are the latest headlines. Russia has denied issuing Ukraine with an ultimatum to surrender its troops in Crimea or face military assault. Well, it was the first day of his trial, and the South African athlete Oscar Pistorius pleaded not guilty to murdering his girlfriend. The star athlete shot dead Reeva Steenkamp a year ago. He says he mistook her for an intruder, but if he's found guilty of premeditated murder, Pistorius could face life imprisonment. Andrew Harding reports.
No tears this time. A calm, focused Oscar Pistorius arrived in court this morning for the start of his murder trial. Something of the old confidence seems to have come back. He's been out on bail for a year now. In the scrum outside, the mother of the woman he shot. This is June Steenkamp. She's never met Pistorius in the flesh before, but came to court today, she says, to look him in the eyes. The athlete's brother also emerged from the crowd. Rarely has an African courthouse attracted such global interest. And because of an unexpected ruling, we can now see live inside Courtroom D. No close-ups of Pistorius allowed, but this morning he quickly denied the charge that he deliberately murdered his girlfriend, Reeva Steenkamp.
How do you plead?
Not guilty, my lady.
And he didn't stop there. Pistorius' lawyers went on the attack, accusing the prosecution of deliberately distorting facts at last year's bail hearing. He came close to accusing the state of trying to frame him.
The only intended purpose of an attempt to introduce inadmissible character evidence would be to engineer and bring about an inadmissible attempted assassination of my character.
But then came the state's first witness, a neighbour. She didn't want to be filmed, but what she said through an interpreter was dramatic enough.
Bang. Bang, bang, bang.
She described hearing the 4 gunshots that night, a long gap after the first one. But crucially, she also spoke of hearing a woman screaming in terror before those shots.
She screamed terribly and she yelled for help.
It's evidence of what the prosecution insists was a fight between Pistorius and Reeva Steenkamp, the reason he allegedly killed her. But the defence then sought to discredit Michelle Berger, asking whether she might be confusing the sound of gunshots
boom, not that,
with the cricket bat Pistorius used to bash down the bathroom door.
Whether I can hear that or not, I don't know. Shots, definitely. I've got no doubt. I heard shots, gunshots, 4. I did not hear a cricket bat hitting a door.
Open up, open up.
This trial is likely to last many weeks, but it's got off to a blistering start.
Andrew Harding there. Before we go, let's bring you all of the latest from the Oscars last night. Alistair Leithhead from Los Angeles.
You can't keep everyone at the Oscars happy all the time, but Lupita Nyong'o certainly had something to dance about. 12 Years a Slave was her first feature film, and she won Best Supporting Actress.
Steve McQueen, you charge everything you fashion with the breath of your own spirit. Thank you so much for putting me in this position. It has been the joy of my life.
Steve McQueen's brutal story of slavery, starring Chiwetel Ejiofor, was tipped for top honours alongside Gravity. The groundbreaking space epic won Alfonso Cuarón Best Director and most of the technical categories. 7 Oscars in all, the biggest haul of the night. This year's host, Ellen DeGeneres, kept the show lively. She tweeted a live star-packed picture that managed to grind the social network to a halt.
Nice.
Cate Blanchett won Best Actress for her performance in Blue Jasmine.
Woody Allen, thank you so much, Woody, for casting me.
Matthew McConaughey won Best Actor for Dallas Buyers Club. And co-star Jared Leto took the prize for Best Supporting Actor.
12 Years a Slave.
But the Oscar for Best Picture went to 12 Years a Slave, and its well-known producer made the introductions to the man of the moment.
One man who brought us all together to tell that story, and that is the indomitable Mr. Steve McQueen.
I dedicate this award to all the people who have endured slavery and the 21 million people who still suffer slavery today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The first black director to win Best Movie, and what a way to celebrate.
Well, thanks to this man's movie, Gravity, a lot of Brits are walking around the after parties clutching a little golden statue this evening. 7 awards for this film made in the UK. But the night belongs to Steve McQueen and his film, 12 Years a Slave. Alistair Leith, BBC News, at the Vanity Fair party in Hollywood.
Congratulations to them all. That's it from me. Stay watching BBC World News.
Hello there, it's time to look at the weather conditions prevailing across Europe in a bit of detail over the next few days. Some pretty lively weather too, with large areas of low pressure swirling around. We've seen flooding rains across the central Mediterranean in recent days. Now wet weather affecting more eastern areas of the Med up through the likes of Greece and Turkey. Some fairly violent storms expected here, and it stays very unsettled further west as well. This is the way it looks overnight. Further heavy rain churning into the central Mediterranean. Quieter further north, particularly northeastern parts of Europe under high pressure. All the action is further south and west on Tuesday. This next arm of wet weather extends up through Italy, with further large amounts of snowfall expected for the southern Alps over the next few days. Now, the eastern end of the Mediterranean will remain fine. Most of the action is further west through the Balkans, as I mentioned. Seen a lot of wet weather recently, more to come. There's that arm of wet weather extending through the Adriatic. Heavy thundery downpours and some pretty low temperatures as well. Greece will see some heavy showers. A bit of a respite for Turkey, and as I mentioned, the eastern end of the Med, hopefully getting away with it. 19 degrees there in Nicosia. That's not particularly warm at this time of year. London sees a bit of a respite through the middle of the week. Signs of spring here in Paris as well, with some sunshine. Should feel very pleasant for Africa. Further showers across the more central and eastern parts of South Africa up into Zimbabwe as well. Cape Town probably seeing some longer sunnier spells, with temperatures here nudging up to 29 degrees. Pretty good for the time of year.